All right, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is going to be an interesting lecture and I think an important one for many reasons. By just mere coincidence, the topic of my lecture today is the civil rights movement and the political and social issues in the United States in the early to mid 1960s. And of course, I'm sure that many of you are aware that the George Floyd trial is taking place. I believe that the arguments in the trial have concluded and that the jury is engaged in deliberation. And, no one can predict what verdict a jury will give. There are a lot of issues related to this case that are extremely emotional and painful and personal for many people. And let's just say that it's a nervous time for the country. The country is bitterly divided in a way that I have never experienced in my lifetime. And it is a tense, difficult time, to say the least. Not this week, but next week, when I cover the late 1960s, we'll talk about the Vietnam War period. And the country was very bitterly divided by the time we get to the late 1960s. 1968, in particular, was a terrible year. The country was divided over multiple issues. The country was divided over the Vietnam War. The country was divided over issues regarding race and racism. And things spiraled out of control in the late 1960s. And in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. There was a very violent reaction to that throughout the country. It was a difficult time. And for many years, I've been teaching this class, and I've often said to myself and occasionally to my students, I would say when I would teach this, how lucky we are that we didn't have to live through the 1960s and much of the difficulty. I mean, think about what's going on in the United States, let's say between 1960 and 1970. All right. Number one, the Cold War is still going on. And with it, the fear and anxiety that a nuclear war with the Soviet Union is becoming even not just possible, but probable. I mean, people lived with this constant anxiety that, life on Earth as we know it could end at any moment as a result of a nuclear war. And we came a lot closer than you think when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. We almost did it for real. Like, we literally came like that close to basically blowing up the world. And if you think that I'm joking or exaggerating, you can look into this on your own. And I would argue that October 1962 might be the single most dangerous moment in the history of planet Earth, because we really almost went through with it. So people lived with that anxiety. I mean, imagine, most of you obviously are younger than I am. I mean, imagine being, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 years old. Imagine graduating from high school, attending college, living in this world where the anxiety that, a nuclear war may prevent you from ever reaching the fullness of adulthood could happen. So the country was in a constant state of anxiety about the Cold War, which is going on throughout the 1960s. Then, of course, there is the terrible issue of racial discrimination going on in the 1960s. As I've made it clear to you in my earlier lectures, the Jim Crow system in the South was very much in effect. Black students and white students were not allowed to go to school together. African Americans, they had to sit at the back of the bus. They would not be served in certain restaurants. They were not allowed to use the bathrooms at gas stations. Everything was segregated. And by the time we get to the late 1950s, early 1960s, that is now being challenged. We have the beginning of what we would describe as the modern civil rights movement. We spoke earlier about Rosa Parks, of course, and about Martin Luther King Jr., who emerges as a leader in the civil rights movement. By the time we get into the early 1960s, things are heating up. There are students, both Black and white, and of mixed ethnicity, who are challenging racial segregation in the South. And, I really have to salute a lot of these young people. I mean, they were literally risking their lives and their safety. So, for example, there is, a restaurant with a lunch counter. In those days, a lot of the department stores all had lunch counters where you could go shopping, let's say. Imagine, for example, you go to a Walmart and they have a restaurant inside. I mean, a lot of them have fast food, but in those days, for example, there was a very well-known department store chain, Woolworths or Montgomery Ward. They don't even exist any longer. And when people would go shopping, you could go in and you could sit down and you could order a sandwich or a cup of coffee or a drink. And of course, it was segregated. And you have young people, college students, who were walking into these stores and going up to these lunch counters. A lot of the drugstores had lunch counters too. It was a very common thing back in the day. So you have young people going to these lunch counters in these restaurants and sitting down in an integrated fashion, expecting to be served. Well, of course, not only were they not served, not only were they denied service, but in many cases they were harassed, threatened, spat upon, physically assaulted, arrested. And I think it takes a great deal of courage for someone who's 18, 19, 20, 21 to basically say, I know that this can happen to me, and I'm going to take that chance, and I'm going to do this anyway because I think it's right. There were similar activities happening with regard to buses. Buses, of course, were segregated, where African Americans had to sit at the back of the bus, and white and Black passengers were not allowed to sit together in an integrated way. And so you'd have these young people. It's not like they only were young college students doing this. I mean, there were other people who did it too, but there were a lot of young college students who were very active in this. And they would get on the bus and they would sit on the bus in an integrated fashion. And there are stories of, these buses being stopped and the passengers being beaten up and the bus, set on fire. I mean, there was violent pushback to the civil rights movement. There were people killed. There was, property was destroyed. I mean, people were beaten up. It was a very scary and difficult and painful moment. I suppose if I wanted to, as an assignment that would be certainly appropriate, I could say, and I may still do this or something similar to it. I may say, compare and contrast the civil rights movement and the difficulties and the social and political divisions in the country in the 1960s with our, social and political divisions of today. Do a little compare and contrast. I like essays and assignments like that because I like the idea of getting you to think about where we are in relation to where we were, and to see how the past has influenced our present, and also to see the similarities and the differences. I like assignments like that. I think they're very useful. I don't really know any of you personally, outside of being your teacher. I haven't even been able to interact with you in person. It's all been done online, so I haven't even had a chance to sit down with any of you, face to face to have a conversation. But I'm sure that I have students who are feeling a great deal of stress and tension by the dealing with the world outside, and seeing how divided it is and how ugly it can become. I will say I think that social media doesn't help, and they call it news, but I really don't think of cable news as news. I think of it as something created for entertainment, to try to, if you're watching a left-wing network, they're going to, tell you what you want to hear to get you fired up to hate the other side. And if you're watching a right-wing network, they do the same. Finding objective, unbiased information, it's amazing because access to information has increased greatly in the modern age, with the internet, and you have Facebook and social media and all the rest. And yet, although access to information has increased, what's happened is people are picking what they want to hear so that their biases can be reinforced, which contributes, in my view, to the social fragmentation, where we are thinking of those with differing views as not just having a difference of opinion, but as, bad people who are a threat. And I don't think that those trends are going to change anytime soon. So we're dealing with some complex, stuff here. And I think it would be very interesting to imagine yourself as a college student in 1967 or 1968, and then look at yourself as a college student today and ask yourself, well, how would my experiences back then have been similar, and how might they have been different? I think that would be a very practical, helpful activity. So we have, throughout the 1960s, the danger of the Cold War and nuclear war, which almost happened. We have discrimination happening against African Americans, especially in the South. We have the civil rights movement is picking up steam, and people are challenging that discrimination and being met in many cases with violence. So, the 1960s, it's not a happy time. It's a time filled with great anxiety. It's interesting. When I first started teaching, I attended a conference, and there was this person as a guest lecturer who was doing a presentation about the 1960s. And this guy was just totally like in love with the 60s, peace and love, and, we're going to change the world. And I thought to myself, well, that's great, but the 1960s in many ways was a very difficult period. And I felt that this particular speaker had romanticized it. And I mean, the 1960s, I was born at the end of that decade. I was born in 1969. The 70s were bad enough, but I'm glad I missed the 60s. And let me tell you why. We start out in 1960 with a very controversial and close presidential election. John Kennedy beats Richard Nixon by a very thin margin, basically by winning the state of Illinois. There were suspicions that there might have been some funny business going on in Illinois. Uh, those rumors, in some ways, persist even to this day. So President Kennedy is elected, but it isn't like he was elected in some sort of landslide majority. I mean, with the country going into that election in 1960 was very divided. So Kennedy wins. If people knew then what we know now about John Kennedy, it's highly unlikely he would have been elected president. He had some very serious health problems and medical conditions which were kept secret. He looked healthy when he ran for president in 1960, but he really wasn't. He looked pretty good because he was being shot up with cortisone shots and steroids and amphetamines and painkillers. He suffered from a medical condition called Addison's disease. He also suffered a back injury during World War II. I mean, John Kennedy, I'll tell you, I mean, he was a war hero. He was the commander of a small boat, PT boat, and the boat that he was commanding, P-2109, was sunk by a Japanese ship, and he acted very heroically to try to save the lives of his men. But in the process, he did permanent injury to his back. And if you've ever had back pain, you know how debilitating it can be. So he, by the time he enters political life, he has some medical issues. He also, frankly speaking, was what today we would describe as a womanizer. He enjoyed chasing after women. He enjoyed fooling around with women. And it didn't matter whether he was married or any of that. And this behavior continued even when he entered political life. And he was, of course, Senator Kennedy before he was President Kennedy. And we now know that even when he was, married and elected to the presidency, he was continuing this type of behavior. In those days, it was much easier to cover stuff up. There was no social media, there were no iPhones, none of that. So, I mean, today it's almost impossible. I mean, all it takes is one person, they take out their iPhone and, click, they snap a picture and it's on the internet within less than 10 seconds. And next thing you know, the whole world knows. Today, somebody would have leaked his medical records and posted them online, or somebody would have gotten a photograph of him, partying out in Palm Springs with Frank Sinatra, where all the, somebody today, you couldn't cover that stuff up. I mean, think about it. When Franklin Roosevelt was president, the man was sworn into office in 1933. He remained president until his death in 1945. And even then, I think probably half the country or more didn't even know the man was in a wheelchair. So, it's a very different time. So Kennedy gets elected in 1960 and immediately has problems. The Cold War was very dangerous in the early 60s. East Berlin remained a very dangerous place. The leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, was old enough to be President Kennedy's father. I don't think he respected Kennedy. I think he thought that he was basically a spoiled rich kid and a playboy. And I don't think that he took President Kennedy seriously, and he thought that he could bully Kennedy. And to some degree, that turned out to be the case. They held a meeting, and Kennedy was going to try to turn on all the charm and develop a working relationship with Khrushchev, and it just didn't work. And Khrushchev really just, tore into him, and it was a real wake-up call. And of course, that particular meeting was made worse by the fact that President Kennedy had injured his back. His back went out on him shortly before the meeting. So he's sitting there for hours with Khrushchev trying to hide the fact that he's in agonizing pain. So there's a lot. One of the things that I like about history, and I may have mentioned this to you before, one of the reasons why studying history is fun is that we can look back on events and we today get to know things that people back then didn't know. So that's sort of interesting and fun for me. So when Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, you're talking about a communist government less than 100 miles south of Florida. I mean, Cuba's what, 90 miles off the Florida coast? So the idea of having a communist government so close to our own shores, well, let's just say that a lot of Americans felt very insecure about it and didn't like it. We've studied the domino theory, and to have a domino fall literally in our own backyard is something that was not well received. So even when Eisenhower was still in office, there was pressure to try to come up with some way of getting rid of Fidel Castro. So the CIA began working on, covert operations and trying to come up with a way of removing Castro. It didn't happen under Eisenhower, but those plans were already in development by the time Kennedy comes into office. Kennedy wants to look tough on communism. In those days, Democrat or Republican, it didn't matter. Nobody wants to look soft on communism. So Kennedy signs off on this planned Cuban invasion that the CIA is putting together. And the plan basically is the CIA at that time is helping to recruit and train anti-communist Cubans who are based largely out of South Florida in and around Miami. And they're going to support these guys and they're going to train these people so that they can overthrow Castro. And so the plan is for them to land in a remote part of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. And they will then, try to overthrow Castro. Kennedy signs off on this. But then at a crucial moment, he makes a decision not to provide these people with American air support or American air cover. And Kennedy's thinking basically is, if Castro is going to be overthrown, let it look to the world that the Cuban people are the ones who got rid of him rather than the United States doing it. Well, the bottom line is that when these men landed at the Bay of Pigs without appropriate air support, it was doomed from the start. And the invasion not only failed, but it failed spectacularly. I mean, this operation crashed and burned right from the beginning. And this was 1961. I mean, Kennedy, this is the first year of the Kennedy presidency. And to be quite honest with you, it made Kennedy look like an inexperienced fool. It got so bad, if you can imagine this, that President Kennedy actually got on the phone to his predecessor, President Eisenhower. And he says to Eisenhower, where did I go wrong here? So I have to give Kennedy credit. I mean, he wants to develop. He wants to learn from his mistakes. So what Eisenhower basically says to Kennedy is he says, look, you don't sign off on something like this until you've had a really thorough roundtable conference with all of the people in your administration to think this through and how this is going to work out and to evaluate what all the scenarios are going to be. That's number one. Number two, he says to Kennedy, did you really think that by withdrawing American air support, people were not going to think this was an American operation? Whether we offered these guys air cover or not, everyone knows and is going to know that the United States is a major player behind this operation. So Kennedy is a young president who is learning. But 1961, things are looking bad. I mean, the situation in Berlin is very tense. We have the Bay of Pigs, which was a fiasco and a disaster. It's not looking good. I mean, Kennedy's first year in office was just one misstep and one disaster after another. I have to say something else about President Kennedy. In all fairness, I think he gets a lot more credit than he deserves for his commitment to civil rights. And I say this because civil rights in the beginning was something he really didn't want to get into. I won't go so far as to say that he didn't care, but he was afraid that if he embraced civil rights too strongly, that he would lose votes in the South. And I'd like to point out also that the reason that Kennedy chose Lyndon Johnson as his running mate is that Lyndon Johnson was from Texas. And Kennedy knew, as a man with a very thick Boston, New England accent, that he needed to have a Southerner on his ticket to balance the ticket to get votes from Southern states. Kennedy's position on civil rights evolves. And he sees on television at this point how civil rights protesters are being beaten and thrown in jail, how young people are, having, fire hoses turned on them, attacked by dogs. I mean, he sees this and recognizes that, number one, this is a very serious problem. Morally, he has to respond. As a leader, he has to respond to this. So he sort of evolves on the issue of civil rights, but he's not really there in the beginning. People often, the problem with President Kennedy, especially because he was assassinated in 1963, is, people have sort of made him into this martyred figure, and they remember him and they remember his policies and his decisions, and they've made him in a way, better than he was. He made a lot of mistakes. I mean, I don't hate the guy. I don't dislike the man, but I mean, certainly if you look at his, his sexual behavior in his private life, he was very reckless, and he continued that behavior even when he was president. I mean, that's just, absurd. And then, he conceals a lot of his medical history because he didn't want people to know how ill he really was. I mean, even as president, he was on all kinds of, different medications to try to manage his pain. In the Bay of Pigs, he didn't handle that well at all. That was a disaster. He meets with Nikita Khrushchev, and Khrushchev just, really just tears into him. And Kennedy really wasn't ready for that. He thought, I'll just turn on the old charm and everything will be fine. And it didn't happen. And then, we get into 1962, and the missile crisis comes, where American spy planes, we used a spy plane at that time called the U-2 spy plane. And so we could monitor what our enemies were doing. And, we detected that nuclear missiles were being placed in Cuba, right off the Florida coast. I mean, there was just no way that we could let that stand. So why does Khrushchev put the missiles there? Well, let's put it this way. If Khrushchev were frightened or afraid of Kennedy, maybe he wouldn't have done that. But he had an impression, Khrushchev, of Kennedy as being weak and being inexperienced. That opinion of Kennedy as weak and inexperienced was reinforced by the fiasco of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Khrushchev thought, well, I sense a little weakness and uncertainty and some inexperience. Let's test the boundaries. So this resulted in Khrushchev miscalculating. He also thought, well, the Americans have nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey. So how can they object if we have nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba? So, the Soviet Union and Khrushchev overreached. And it was evident right from the beginning that there was no way that the United States was going to allow nuclear missiles to be, permanently based in Cuba. It wasn't going to happen. And this is the beginning of what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. I mean, from start to finish, this thing lasted about 2 weeks. In fact, there's a really good film about it called 13 Days. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. And so then the question is, well, how do you get the missiles out without starting World War III? People in military command wanted immediately to launch a military strike. They wanted to bomb Cuba, destroy the missiles, invade the island, and get rid of Castro. And Kennedy, to his credit, kept his cool and said, well, wait a minute, we start bombing Cuba, not only are we going to kill Cubans, we're going to kill Russian personnel. And then, of course, if we invade Cuba, we're going to see, Berlin, West Berlin will probably be invaded as a retaliatory move. And next thing you know, one side escalates, another side retaliates, and next thing you know, before you know it, the missiles are flying. A very dangerous time. So in the end, the Kennedy administration came up with the idea of a blockade. Kennedy didn't even want to use the term blockade. They called it a quarantine. We were going to use the Navy to encircle the island of Cuba to make sure that no more missiles arrived. It doesn't get the missiles out that are already there, but it sends a message to Khrushchev that we are aware the missiles are there. We will not allow any additional missiles to be transported to Cuba. And these missiles have to go. So it was a way of sending a message to Khrushchev that we were going to respond just short of war. So this was important too, because we wanted to give Khrushchev a way to get out of this too, because as much as the Americans were in a bind over this, so was he, because he doesn't want to appear weak either. This went on for almost 2 weeks from start to finish. President Kennedy gives an address to the nation and delivers what is probably the most terrifying speech ever given by an American president. And President Kennedy says, quote, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as an attack against the United States." No, let me start this over again. "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union." So basically what Kennedy is saying is that if any one of these missiles goes off, we're going to attack the Soviet Union immediately. We will retaliate. If they're going to launch one of these nukes, we're going to launch ours. And to say that people had their blood run cold, you might remember when the coronavirus pandemic really first started, how there was a mad rush at the grocery stores because people didn't know what to expect or how long it would be, or if we were going to really be unable to leave the home, or if we'd be able to get food. And I'm sure, I remember very clearly in the early days of the pandemic, you couldn't get paper goods, toilet paper, paper towel, napkins, gone. But pasta, rice, beans, those, you may remember the early days of this. The shelves at the grocery stores were pretty much picked clean. I myself, I loaded up my freezer with as much, meat and frozen vegetables as I could pack into it, because, who knew how long this was going to be, or what the impact would be, or what it would be like. We didn't know. So a lot of people did panic shopping. Kennedy gives that speech, and that is what happens. People are like, oh my God, this is it. This is really it. We could be involved in a nuclear war at any moment. And if we do survive, we better make sure that we have whatever supplies we can. So the stores were picked clean in October of 1962 when this announcement came. Houses of worship, churches, and so on were basically open 24 hours a day for people who wanted to engage in prayer. People who were Catholic could go to confession. It was terrifying in a way that is difficult to explain. The closest I could get to try to explain this to you is if you've ever had a moment in your life, God forbid, where you thought, what I'm going through is something I may not live through, where maybe you had pneumonia, or God forbid, you were in a car accident, or you were diagnosed with a very serious illness, and you thought, I don't know if I'm going to live through this. This is what the Cuban Missile Crisis did to people, not only in the United States, but around the world. I mean, it really looked like, this is going to be the end. So psychologically, you can imagine the terror of this. In the end, cooler heads prevailed. I also think we were very lucky, to be honest with you, very lucky. So Kennedy promises that the United States will not invade Cuba and will not overthrow Fidel Castro. And that gives Khrushchev something where he can say, Kennedy was going to attack Cuba and invade Cuba and get rid of Castro, but I stopped it. So that gives Khrushchev something he can use to the hardline people in his government to say, I got something out of this deal. So the agreement basically is the Russians will remove the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. But there was a side deal that was done secretly, not made public, where the United States agreed that we would remove our nuclear missiles from Turkey. But that was something that was going to happen later, 6 months later, so that it would not appear that we were, excuse me, so it would not appear that we were selling out a NATO ally as a way of trying to get out of this deal, out of this crisis. So, that's what happened. We did not invade Cuba. The Russians agreed to pull their missiles out, and 6 months later, we pulled our missiles out of Turkey. But during the time period that this went on, it's like having a loaded gun pointed at your head, and you're looking right at it, and you're hoping that no one pulls the trigger. I mean, that's how close we came to blowing up the world. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is huge. So that's another thing that contributes to the tension of the 60s. So now we're 1962. Now let's get to 1963. Vietnam is now going to start to heat up. Vietnam, by that point, was a divided country, much like Korea. You have North Vietnam, which is a communist state being backed up by the Soviet Union and by China. South Vietnam is not communist, but was ruled by a very authoritarian leader named Diem. And Diem and South Vietnam are trying to prevent North Vietnam and the North Vietnamese communists from taking over the whole of the country. So we, the United States, are supporting South Vietnam. The Russians and the Chinese are supporting North Vietnam. So all the pieces are on the board in terms of how this is going to play out. We had a lot of problems with Diem in South Vietnam because he was trying to hold his country together, but he was also extraordinarily ruthless in how he went about it. And there were a lot of people in South Vietnam, many of them young people, college students, who felt that South Vietnam, although not communist, was becoming a totalitarian dictatorship, and that people were being persecuted if they questioned the government, and that it was not a good situation. So from the perspective of the Kennedy administration, yeah, we want to support South Vietnam, and yeah, we want to stop the spread of communism. We just wish that we had a better partner. So Kennedy, in 1963, just a couple weeks before he himself is assassinated, Kennedy himself gives the green light to overthrow the president of South Vietnam. So basically, you have these generals in South Vietnam. You have people in South Vietnam who are saying, we can do better than this guy. And you have President Kennedy and people in the Kennedy administration saying, we wish we could do better than this guy. So there is a plot to basically overthrow and assassinate the president of South Vietnam. And President Kennedy basically gives a wink and a nod to it and says, okay, we that's okay with us. You can do that. It's one of those decisions, I think, that Kennedy regretted it immediately. The president of South Vietnam was assassinated. And, there's this old saying, you might have heard this saying, if you broke it, you bought it. And the fact that the Kennedy administration gave the green light to this meant that if things got worse and it didn't work, we were going to be sucked into this. And we were already being sucked into it more than we wanted. In the beginning, under Kennedy, we are sending South Vietnam military equipment, supplies, and we have military advisors there who are supposed to be helping South Vietnam defend itself against North Vietnam, although a lot of these, so-called military advisors were taking a more active role. They weren't just advising. In some cases, they're being involved in planning and participating in combat operations. So we're slowly getting gradually more and more and more and more sucked into this. I think Kennedy realized by the time we get, toward the, middle of 1963, certainly after the assassination of Diem, that this is like stepping into quicksand, and we need to try to get out while we can. I can't predict the future, and I can't rewrite the past. I don't know what would have happened if President Kennedy had lived. What I do know is that under Lyndon Johnson, who became president after Kennedy was assassinated, we escalate our involvement in Vietnam. And by the time we get to 1968, Kennedy is assassinated in 63, November 22nd of 63. By the time we get to 68, we've got well over, 500,000 Americans are in Vietnam. And I'd have to look and review my notes to find out what the total number was at the highest level of American involvement. But we are sending more and more and more and more of our soldiers over to Vietnam. I'd like to point out during the Vietnam War that the average age of the combat soldier was only 19 years old. For those of you who are 18, 19, or 20, ask yourself if you feel psychologically ready to engage in war and in a combat situation where you will witness the greatest horrors imaginable. Would we have had 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam if Kennedy had lived? I can't give you a definite answer to that question, but if I had to guess, I would say probably not. I think that Kennedy, by the time he reaches the end, is realizing that this war is not something that is going to go well, and that there's really not going to be any degree of winning, just degrees of losing. Kennedy, before his death, gives an interview, I believe it was to Walter Cronkite, where he describes the situation in Vietnam. And he says in the interview, ultimately it's their war, and they're the ones who are going to have to fight it. We can help, we can give them equipment and supplies and training, but he uses the language, it's their war and they're the ones who are going to have to fight it. So I think that's a window into his thinking at the time. But he is assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Lyndon Johnson comes in and wants to look tough on communism, of course. And things will escalate from there. And we are going to be sending in ground troops to Vietnam. We are going to start bombing Vietnam. And it's going to be very damaging in every way you can possibly imagine. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because my lecture on the Vietnam War is not today. But even before the Vietnam War really escalates, what I'm trying to say is that we're headed in that direction. We're walking a road that is going to lead us to a very ugly and destructive war. And even though we weren't fully there yet under Kennedy, we were walking on that road in that direction under Kennedy. Whether we would have gotten off that road if Kennedy had lived, I can't say with any absolute certainty. I think he would have changed course, but frankly, I don't know. I can't tell you. I don't know. So Kennedy, as I said, he signs off on this assassination. There is this extraordinary recording where Kennedy is dictating notes into a recording device that he wants his secretary to type up. And there is this extraordinary recording where he is sitting in his office and he admits, I made a mistake. This assassination was abhorrent. We should never have approved it. We should have thought this through a little bit better. And he admits that not only did he make a mistake, but that he's the one responsible. That's extraordinary. Now, that's another example. I mean, that's not something the American public was going to hear in 1963. And that's another example of us today having an opportunity to know things that people back then didn't know. So 1963, is a rough year. November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is in Dallas. And I should have thought about this. I may have shown you, I have some political memorabilia in my home. My father collected a lot of it. When President Kennedy was killed, he was in Dallas, Texas, and he was on his way to a luncheon. And of course, he never made it. And I have in my home one of the invitations to that luncheon that he never arrived to make it. And I should have thought of it before I started my lecture. I would have gone into the other room and I would have taken it off the wall and I would have shown it to you. So maybe if I remember next time, I'll do that. But he's getting ready. By the end of 1963, he's getting ready for 64 because 64 is an election year. So he's getting warmed up for the 64 election, and he is in Dallas. And of course, he is riding through the streets of the city in an open car, and he is shot in the head and killed. And it's funny, when I was a child and I began to learn about history for the first time, and I was old enough to comprehend it. I don't know how old you have to be to have any comprehension of these things, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. And I remember as a child, when I learned about the Kennedy assassination, because my parents would talk about it often. And I remember even as a kid thinking to myself, well, he's the president. Why would he ride in a convertible? Like even as a child, I thought like, well, I mean, if you're a person who's important with a big job, you have to be safe. And why would you ride a car through a city that doesn't have a top on it? And I remember like when my parents explained to me what happened here for the first time, even as a child, I thought to myself, well, that didn't need to happen. Why is he riding around without a top on the car? It's like the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, you would think you would think at the end of the Civil War that when Abraham Lincoln goes to the theater, he's going to have a couple of bodyguards standing outside the door. Wouldn't you think? I mean, John Wilkes Booth, when he kills Abraham Lincoln, he walks right up into the box where Lincoln is sitting, and there isn't even anybody at the door. There isn't even a struggle. There isn't even a security guard or an army soldier. There's nobody there to protect the guy, protect Lincoln. I mean, it's like you're at the end of a civil war that killed 600,000 Americans, and you're not even going to have a single soldier guarding the door. I mean, what are you thinking? And the same with Kennedy. I mean, the country was very divided over the issue of civil rights by the time we get to 1963. Threats had been made. There were a lot of people who did not like Kennedy. You would think that somebody would have said, maybe it's a good idea if we don't drive you through town in a convertible. So I don't know. I don't get it. So November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy is killed. In that assassination, the governor of Texas, who was riding in the car sitting in front of Kennedy, was also shot, but he survived. When Kennedy was shot, the first shot got him in the throat, and there's the famous Zapruder film that shows him grabbing his throat, and then his wife leans over and tries to figure out what's going on, and then he is shot in the head, and of course blood and bone and brain matter basically just cover everybody in the car, including poor Mrs. Kennedy, who wore that blood-stained dress for the remainder of the day. And it's a surreal moment. I mean, President Kennedy was killed when they were ready to transport his body back to Washington, D.C. I mean, just imagine being Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy. They land in Dallas. It's a nice day. They're having this event. She's wearing this famous pink dress, and they land, in Dallas. They're flying on Air Force One. And a few hours later, she's back on Air Force One, and her dead husband's body is in a coffin in the back of the plane. She is covered still in her husband's blood. And the vice president, Lyndon Johnson, is going to stand next to her and take the oath of office to be sworn in as president. And she did not change her clothes until she got back to the White House. And that bloody dress still remains in the possession of the Kennedy family. It has never been put on public display. But to say that is the worst experience a person could have, I mean, it's pretty bad. I'd also like to point out, even though this won't be on a quiz or a test, that around the time President Kennedy assumed office, at the time his wife was pregnant, and the child was born, I believe, prematurely and did not survive. So they suffered the loss of a baby. So Jackie Kennedy is a woman that I've always had great sympathy for. She was pregnant at the time that her husband is elected and loses the baby. And then, 2 years later, her husband is shot. Literally, she saw him die, literally, like looking right at him when he's shot in the head, covered in his blood for the remainder of the day. I've always had great sympathy for her. There's actually a very good film I'll recommend. It's simply called Jackie. And I can't remember, Natalie Portman plays Jackie Kennedy and gives a very moving performance in that film. So if you're interested, it's a film I recommend. It really does a good job of capturing the moment. And then Jackie has to go back to the White House and get herself cleaned up and then explain to her two young children that daddy is never coming home. So, I have always had great sympathy for her. And of course, President Kennedy's son and Jackie's son, John Kennedy Jr., died in a plane crash. And I remember when that happened, my first thought was, I'm glad she didn't live to see that, because she herself had died, I think, a year or two earlier. And I thought to myself, my God, imagine if the woman had lived to see her husband assassinated and then her only son killed in a plane crash. So she passed away. She didn't live to see that. President Kennedy and Jackie, their daughter, Caroline, still survives. The Kennedy family has had more than its share of tragedy. I could do a whole semester just on the history of the Kennedy family and the tragedies that have befallen them. Some of them of their own making, and some of them not. It's pretty fascinating stuff and very tragic. I mean, Shakespeare could not create characters of greater tragedy and drama than the Kennedy family, and I'll leave it at that. So 1963, we have the Kennedy assassination. Before the Kennedy assassination, in the summer of '63, we also have the very famous speech by Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream speech. There was a civil rights march on Washington on August 28th, 1963. And it is one of the great speeches of American history, in my view. President Kennedy's inaugural address is considered one of the great speeches. You may recall we covered Franklin Roosevelt, who, when he was inaugurated, gave the famous speech where he says, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." When President Kennedy was inaugurated, he gives a speech where he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It's 1963, it's August, the civil rights movement is well underway. There is a massive civil rights march in Washington, D.C. with Martin Luther King. And he gives what has gone down in history as a very famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. And in light of the issues affecting the country today, I think the timing of this, I didn't plan it, but the timing of this is certainly appropriate. And what I'd like to do is end this class by playing you an excerpt from that very famous speech, and ask yourself, what are the principles that are represented in that speech, and are these principles respected today the way that Martin Luther King wanted them to be? One of the most famous lines from that speech is that he says, "I have a dream that one day my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." So I think a question that is valid to ask is, do we live in that society or do we not? Where do you feel his speech has been realized, and where do you feel his speech has not yet been fully realized, or are there people who oppose it still? So these are very complex issues, very personal for many people. So I want to close out today's class by playing you an excerpt from this very important speech and a very important moment in American history. So please pay careful attention.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring in Whitney Capital. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
That is one of the great speeches in American history. It is certainly, I think, profound and relevant as much today as it was then. And in light of the issues that the country is dealing with today, I think that listening to that speech requires thoughtful reflection. And these are things that, even though I'm your history teacher, there are a lot of issues that you have to think about for yourselves. You are enrolled in this class. You want to complete the class. You want to get a grade, hopefully a good grade. But you also are living in this country and you're living in this world, and there are issues that remain difficult, complex, painful, and unresolved. And what you will discover is that a lot of the issues of the present have roots in the past, which is one of the reasons why I think history is so critical. So on that note, I really have nothing further to add. I will allow you, if you wish, to please ask questions or make comments. Is there anyone, based on today's lecture, who has a question they'd like to ask or a comment they'd like to make? Well, at the very least, I hope I've given you something to think about, and you are free to go until next time. So thank you for
Thanks,
being here.
Professor.
Thank you.